So in Lab 3, we're going to cover the anatomy of the spinal cord, cranial nerves, which we've already covered location on, and spinal nerves. So let's start with the anatomy of the spinal cord. So recall that the spinal cord and brain are covered by meninges, which are connective tissue layers that isolate it from the rest of the body. So when we're looking at this spinal cord, this outer layer that is sitting against the adipose tissue here on the inside of the vertebral foramen is our dura mater. Notice that there's a little dark line right here, and then on the inside of it we have our arachnoid mater. And then this space we're seeing right here is the subarachnoid space, and that's where we would find cerebral spinal fluid, which cushions the spinal cord against mechanical trauma. And then right on the surface of the spinal cord we have this gray covering, which would be the pia mater. Now, as we're looking at how nerves arise off of the spinal cord, then if you'll recall, when you put two vertebrae together, we get this opening right here, which would be an intervertebral foramen. And so nerves arise off the spinal cord and pass through intervertebral foramen. So within a nerve, we have afferent information, which is sensory, and efferent information, which is motor. So the sensory information that comes in, the cell bodies are on this enlargement right here, which is a dorsal root ganglia. And then the axons of these sensory neurons continue on to the spinal cord, and they form these groups of axons we see here, which we call the dorsal root. So afferent information, sensory information, enters the posterior or dorsal aspect of the spinal cord. The motor information, which would arise here on the ventral aspect of the spinal cord, exits the spinal cord by these nerve fibers here, which are called the ventral roots. And the dorsal and ventral roots then come together to form a spinal nerve. Now, as we look at the spinal cord itself, then notice that the spinal cord is strongly separated into left and right sides. And so the separation anteriorly is called an anterior median fissure, and the separation posteriorly is called a posterior median sulcus. So the word fissure implies this is going to be a wider, deeper division than this one, which is the sulcus. Now, when we look at the organization of the spinal cord is divided into gray matter, which contains certain neuron cell bodies, which looks like a butterfly, and white matter surrounding that contains a cross-sectional view of nerve fibers. So when we're looking at the gray matter, we divide the gray matter into horns. So the dorsal root communicates with the dorsal horn, which is where sensory information enters the gray matter. Information exits the gray matter either via lateral horns, which we're seeing here, which would allow nerve fibers to go out and move up and down the spinal cord, and the ventral horn, which is what the ventral root arises off of that we see here and here. So in a quick review, we can divide the gray matter into dorsal horn, lateral horn, and ventral horn. Now, there's actually part of the gray matter that crosses the spinal cord, and at the center of that we have a tube, which is called the central canal. And the central canal is a remnant to the fact that our spinal cord developed as a tube initially. And so the gray matter that crosses either posterior to or anterior to the central canal is called a commissure. And so if it's in front of our central canal, we can call it the anterior gray commissure. And if it's posterior to the central canal, we can call it the posterior gray commissure. White matter is subdivided into columns. And they're called columns because nerve fibers are moving up and down the spinal cord, either ascending or descending in a communication mechanism. So the columns are subdivided into the ones that are between the ventral horns, so we call them the anterior columns. The columns to the side, which are called the lateral columns, and the columns that are sandwiched between the dorsal horns, which are called the posterior or dorsal columns. So as a quick review again, we have a left and right anterior column, we have a left and right lateral column, and we have a left and right posterior column.